Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Beyond Micro Enterprise, Secrets to Growth from Micro to Small Enterprise, featuring CFI fellow Christy Stickney. I'm Sonia Kelly. I'm the Director of Research at the Center for Financial Inclusion. For those of you unfamiliar with us, the Center for Financial Inclusion is an action-oriented think tank that's working to advance financial inclusion around the world. Let me talk a little bit about the CFI Fellows Program and the history of it. The CFI Fellows Program was created in 2015. We're going to advance the slide here to the CFI Fellows Program. It was created in 2015 with the goal of encouraging independent researchers and consultants and even folks within institutions to think about some of the really big unanswered questions in financial inclusion. We found that in our own work, there were some questions that we were grappling with that we didn't feel like the industry was really making progress on, and this program was designed to address that. What we saw was a hole in our industry. Our first cohort was a cohort of 4 people located in 3 different countries, conducting research on 9 different markets. And Christy Stickney, who you're going to hear from today, was one of that cohort. I should also mention that many of you probably saw the request for proposals that went out just a few months ago for our second cohort. And we're going to be announcing those 5 fellows in early December in a webinar, so stay tuned for that. So having talked about the CFI Fellows Program, I'm going to turn it over to our Managing Director, Elizabeth Ryan, to talk a little bit more about why we created this question in particular. Elizabeth Ryan is the Managing Director, as I mentioned, for the Center for Financial Inclusion. I won't talk about all of her qualifications, but they are many. You can go, I'm sure many of you know her and her reputation precedes her. So let me turn it over to Beth to talk a little bit more about this question of how micro entrepreneurs grow to SME size.
So thanks, Sonia, and thank you all for joining. The origin of this topic was conversations that took place within Acción about the prevalence of small businesses in their portfolio, in the portfolios of the partner organizations that Acción works with. And the particular question was, well, we know that many of the organizations have put in small business lines and are starting to serve small businesses in addition to micro enterprises. But how many of those small businesses actually grew from micro enterprises, and what were the secrets involved in allowing them to make that transition from micro to small? So we wanted to really understand that because it's part of the success narrative that has always accompanied microfinance. And unfortunately, as Christy will talk about, we found that success narrative happens less frequently than we would like, or than we accepted or expected. But we think it's very important to take a closer look at the positive deviance and understand what it is that allowed them to excel. And hopefully the research will help in 2 ways. One is better selection of clients that have that kind of potential. And the second is better support to them. And I think that the selection, there's been a lot of focus on selection, and some of what Christy has found does help with selection. It helps you identify those businesses that have the kind of single-minded focus that is going to lead to growth. But I think what's more interesting for me, at any rate, in the research that she's done, is looking at how better to support those growth paths. And just for example, I think one of the things that's the most interesting is the emphasis on premises and how access to market through having appropriate premises is a huge aspect and a huge hurdle in the path from micro to small. And it seems to me that this is something that could receive a lot more focus from lenders, because lenders are in a position to be able to help, but may not have been focusing on this as such a critical part of the growth strategy. So that's just one part of Christy's findings that really appeals to me and that I think is important. But I will let Christy talk, and then hopefully hear some comments from those of you in the audience.
Thanks, Beth. Well, we've put a few framing questions up on the screen so that you can keep those in mind as Christy moves forward in her presentation. I think Beth talked about the most important themes to think about as we move forward. Let me go ahead without further ado, introduce Christy Stickney. She is an independent development consultant and has worked in financial services and inclusive market development since 2010. She's been engaged in microfinance since 1993. In fact, Christy helped to develop a loan and savings product for women micro-entrepreneurs, and then went on to design a variety of other types of financial products and services. She's worked for over 2 decades in this field with Habitat for Humanity International, with Opportunity International, and with the Agros Foundation, directing technical assistance and financial support to poverty-focused loan and savings programs around the world. So when we wanted someone to tackle this question, we thought Christy was exactly the right person to do so. She's been involved in the creation of programs, in the evaluation of programs, and has a very rich background in that sense. She's lived throughout Latin America and the Philippines, in fact, and is currently based in San Jose, Costa Rica. On a personal note, I should mention that every time I've connected with Christy on this project, we tend to meet over Skype, and there have been a few times when she's shown me by video the vistas that she's looking out on from her home in Costa Rica. And she just mentioned this morning that while in DC it's chilly and a little bit blustery, it's a balmy 70 degrees in Costa Rica right now. So we're all a little bit envious, but hope that you can share a little bit of that sunshine and great weather on the webinar as you move forward. Christy, I'll turn it over to you and you can take it from here.
Thanks so much, Sonia, and good day to all of you. That is a photo. I'm on the right side there in that photo, and I'm actually not a giant, even though I might look like it there. I'm standing next to Rita, who is one of the 55 entrepreneurs I interviewed as part of this research. She and her husband own 2 paint stores in a low-income community in the outskirts of Lima. And so it's great to be introduced along with her. Let's see. What I'm going to do is start with a roadmap of this presentation. I'll begin with a rather brief high-level summary of the study itself, how I conducted the study, and some of the focus and definitions that I've used. And then we'll delve deeply into some of the findings, which have been alluded to already. We'll look specifically at the qualities of these high-growth enterprises and their owners, also the growth progression, how they've moved from micro to small enterprise. And then we'll look at some of the gender and aging implications that have arisen as well. And during the last, hopefully, half hour or so of our time, we'll have a rich discussion, and that'll be a time to receive some questions from the rest of you. So that's our roadmap for this presentation. And so starting with the study, this was the primary research focus as I ventured into this. I was really set out, as Beth was mentioning, I set out to identify who are these clients among microfinance institutions that began at a micro level and have successfully transformed their businesses into what could be classified as an SME. And what can be learned from them, from their experiences? What are their characteristics, both of the entrepreneurs and of their businesses? What have been their growth processes? What have their journeys looked like? What obstacles have they encountered? And then how have they used financial services to their benefit? What services have they used and how have these been best leveraged for the sake of growing their businesses? As well as, are there any non-financial services that have been helpful in their business development pursuits? I'd like to start with a clarification of the definition of SME. I just, after a lot of deliberation, I decided to settle on a definition set forth by the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which it takes into account the number of employees. As we can see from this image, the top three segments of this pyramid represent what I'm calling the SME sector. Those are businesses that have anywhere between 5 and all the way up to 250 employees. And we could say that this entire pyramid represents the MSME, micro, small, and medium enterprise universe in the developing world. It's not really proportionally representative because really the micro enterprise sector is by far the largest. And as many know, the businesses with no employees that are owner operated with no employees make up by far the majority of even that segment. But as we move upwards towards more employees, we see what's called a very small enterprise segment that has 5 to 9 employees. And so I've decided, following along with the IFC definition, to include those within the SME sector. Then we have the standard small enterprise and the medium enterprise in their different ranges. And you'll see off to the left a kind of visual representation also of formalization, and that would be businesses that have achieved some level of either government registration, maybe paying into a tax regimen, and could even have employees that are considered formal. And so those enterprises really are a minority in the overall pyramid, and as we rise up into higher business sizes, it tends to be a greater and greater proportion. So the research process itself, I could describe in about there were about 4 different steps. One first step was choosing the country and the institutions with which to work. From the outset, we decided to conduct the research in Latin America, being a rather mature setting for microfinance, and relatively stable markets and many large institutions from which to choose. And I settled on Mi Banco, which is one of the largest institutions in the region, microfinance institutions, which is in Peru, Banco Solidario in Ecuador, and then Banco Adopem in the Dominican Republic. With these institutions, I received their client databases, and we passed those through several filters to try to select. The filters involved setting a threshold, a maximum threshold from regarding loan size, initial loan size. So those have begun with really small loans under a certain level, and who were currently borrowing above another threshold, another minimum threshold, and who had continuously borrowed for at least a period of 3 years. So those are the sets that you'll see on the right in the lighter shade. So the larger bars on this graph represent the total number of clients of these institutions, and on the right are what we could consider the study samples, the study sets, which are already relatively small in these different institutions. From these sets, I worked with the MFI staff to select a pool of candidates that we could interview, and we focused on urban centers, specifically the capital cities of the 3 countries, plus Guayaquil in Ecuador as well, and tried to get a proportional representation of gender, business types from the different sectors, service, production, and trade sectors, as well as those that were located within those capital cities. And so ultimately we scheduled 20 interviews per country, and I achieved a total of 55. And that was really the basis of the qualitative research that formed the heart of this study. So from there we'll move into, we'll dive into the fun part, which is the outcomes. And starting with what Beth has already signaled, the micro to small or micro to SME client pool really is a disappointingly small proportion of the total client pools of these institutions. And even as I carefully selected clients from among the study sets, among those I interviewed, I would say no more than 25% were actually operating SMEs. And I'll talk in a minute about kind of the remaining 75%. Who are they? What do they look like? But first, I'd really like to focus on and actually make a case for the strategic importance of this really small pool. And one is the poverty impact that they're having. These are businesses that are clearly producing income for the business owners, their families, their immediate families, and even beyond extended families. But they're also creating jobs within those marginalized communities, and so employing people that really are also in contexts of poverty and marginalization, as well as contributing to these base of pyramid, these low-income economies, by purchasing inputs, by supplying goods and services, by purchasing other services, and all of the economic benefits that come from operating growing enterprises within these contexts. Secondly, these entrepreneurs, they show us so much, both in terms of who they are, what are their characteristics as high-growth entrepreneurs, and then what do their growth paths look like, and what can we learn about those trajectories. So specifically, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to what we call, through the study, I've decided to call the growth entrepreneurs. As I interviewed clients, a distinct group of business owners emerged, and they were operating higher growth enterprises. And they also had a very clear vision for the future growth of their business. It was something so tangible, and it was quantifiable. It was a direction they were clearly moving in. And they also had effectively incorporated several non-family employees within their business, which is a key growth step. And we'll talk about that a little more in detail in one of the coming slides. These would be kind of defining characteristics of this group. But in addition, there were other descriptive characteristics that they all had in common. One is this level of focus. These were entrepreneurs who were devoting their time and resources really to only one business, one income generating activity, and were not diversifying, and even their investments, the loans they were taking, were really being directed towards this one business endeavor. And that was just a really outstanding characteristic of this group. Another was we could say the level of organization, the fact that they were keeping financial records, whether written or computerized, and there was a tendency to increase their administration as their business was growing. In recognition of the need for this. So these were probably the essential characteristics, I would say, that really stood out of this group of entrepreneurs. There were some other tendencies among them, such as they tended to have higher levels of education, whether they came into business ownership already possessing that level of education, or whether, as in many cases, they pursued higher education and college degrees or further education in order to better manage their growing business. Another tendency, which we'll talk about a little bit more in another slide, is also the really really low presence of women as owners among these growth entrepreneurs. They generally would not. There was only one case really where a woman was a growth entrepreneur owning and leading a business. However, in many cases, 64% of the cases, they operated as co-owners jointly with another family member, generally a spouse, but at other times it was with a son, a daughter, or a sibling. So those are the key characteristics I want to highlight about them. And we're going to take actually a moment right now to hear from you, because we'd like to know how do these characteristics of growth entrepreneurs match your own observations of high growth enterprises. So Sonia, you're going to take us forward with the survey now.
Yeah, we're just about to put up a poll on the screen, so keep an eye on your screen. It's going to pop up here. So Christy just presented those 4 characteristics of growth entrepreneurs that she saw as trends in her research, and we want to know which of these matches your observations of owners of high growth enterprises. So there are 4 options here. One is that they're visionaries. Like Christy said, they have a clear vision of growth for their business. One is that they're employers, so they effectively involve non-family employees in their business. One is that they're focused, meaning they devote their time and resources to growing only one business. They're not diversifying in a big way. And then the final one is that they're organized. They keep financial records and increase administration as their business grows. Christy saw all 4 of these, but we want to know which resonates most with you. And in fact, you can select more than one answer if you just can't choose. So go ahead and make that selection. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to go ahead and read that and make your selection. All right, we see the answers coming in, and I see some folks are voting twice, which is great because we want to make sure that we're inclusive of the things that you're seeing out there in the marketplace. All right, well, let's go ahead and close that poll. We have the majority of people have voted, and we're going to share the results here. We're putting the results up on the screen. So this is really interesting to me that the clear vision came out first. Christy, do you see anything that you want to highlight that's interesting to you about the results of this poll?
This is very helpful. It's true. Yeah, the vision is crucial, and so it's good to see that resonates with other people's observations. I'd be curious to know whether these other points are more like, are they surprises that they've been listed, or they're just kind of not as clearly visible in this group?
Yeah, and I think we can definitely flag that as something we can talk about in our discussion time. Christy, do you want to continue? I know that you have some stories of entrepreneurs who exhibited these characteristics.
Yeah, the report is full of stories, has several stories. I want to show you some pictures. There we go. Okay, these are 2 of the different growth entrepreneurs, two of the entrepreneurs I interviewed. The first on the left there, that's Magda and her husband and daughter. They're running the cash register at a campus restaurant at a university in Quito. And down below is Laura and Miguel. They have a furniture workshop in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And I put them up there because they both really are very clear examples of enterprises that began at very, very small level. Magda really began with, she was selling very simple snacks, actually candies, at a stall practically within the campus, and gradually moved to different locations within the campus until she finally secured this coveted spot. And when she took that over, that truly it converted her business into something entirely different. And that was the point actually when her husband he left his job and joined her in the business, and is actually pretty much the leader now of that enterprise. Magda runs the kitchen, and her daughter helps out there often when she's on vacation from her studies. But a great example of one who began with a really, really micro business and moved that into something that is clearly now a small enterprise. In the case of Laura and Miguel, I tell this story in the report, but they began their business at a little home-based workshop in their in a home that was in a very precarious location by a river, and the community, including their home and workshop, were washed out in a flood, and they lost everything and had to begin again. And fortunately, there were lenders like Banco Adopem that were willing to lend to them in those conditions and help them get back on their feet. And as a result, they relocated to a part of the community that was much more strategic for their business. So it gave them greater visibility and also allowed them to access markets much more easily to distribute their furniture. So in the end, even though it was a huge setback, it's something that it propelled them forward towards much greater growth. So. All right, what's happened with the other 75% of the clients I interviewed? I'd like to take just a little peek at them because it is interesting to understand who they are as well. So we have the growth entrepreneurs. There were 25% of those I interviewed. And then I've sub-segmented. The remainder of them I'll call lower growth, but it's not to diminish who they are or their contribution or value. There are three different segments, as I mentioned here. They're what I would call the strivers, the sustainers, and then the slowing down clients. And the strivers, they continue to have a clear vision of growth, similar to the growth entrepreneurs, perhaps not quite as clear, not quite as convincing, but they also have not been able to add non-family employees the way the growth entrepreneurs have, and most of them are caught at some moment, a hurdle, an obstacle that seems to be limiting their ability to move to a next stage. The sustainers are still seeking modest business growth, but much less clarity there. They seem to be relatively stable where they are, and with just a little bit of intention of growing, but also tend to be more diversified in their business ventures. And then the slowing down, which is quite a large segment, it's a third of the entire group, they're actually maintaining or even reducing their business involvement. And the tendency as we move from left to right on this, it's almost like a continuum, is we see more women. We see clients that are older in age and tend to be more concentrated in the trade sector for their businesses, and much more diversification in general in these three groups. We really didn't see that in the growth entrepreneurs, but that is a more common strategy, especially approaching the slowing down group. And their diversification is not just parallel businesses, but also investing in businesses or economic ventures of other family members, building their homes, building homes of family members, and investing in other sources of income such as rental cars, rental properties, which I'll mention a little further along. So now let's talk about the enterprise growth progression, and specifically these growth hurdles, which, as Beth mentioned, it's a central finding, I feel, of the study. And as I embarked on the research, what I'd hoped to find was a description of a type of growth progression or a path, a sequence that might be similar across growing enterprises. However, it just simply wasn't the case. There was no clear linear progression. As enterprises, they seem to repeat steps, depending on the type of enterprise and the type of growth they were pursuing, and even had to remake themselves following a crisis or setback. So the idea of a linear progression just didn't hold up. Instead, what emerged was a set of hurdles, and there are 4 of them here that I list because they were the commonly faced hurdles at different points along the enterprise growth path, and they became kind of the necessary obstacle that needed to be overcome in order for the business to advance in its growth. So the first one we see on the left is it's the most common growth steps. As I mentioned here, 69% of those I interviewed actually surpassed this hurdle, and some of them repeatedly, several times, which is the acquisition of fixed assets. And it involves, a larger purchase, such as a vehicle, many times a vehicle, some equipment, machinery, furniture, and it really becomes a hurdle when capital is not available and when the necessary financing can't be secured. And this generally was not a hurdle for the clients I interviewed because they had access to credit. And so thankfully, this did not present a great hurdle for this group that I was interviewing. A second common growth hurdle is the incorporation, as I mentioned before, of non-family employees. And it seems that a really important step in reaching beyond a pool of family members, which is the natural initial step to incorporate family members as employees, is to reach out and employ outsiders, which brings along associated costs as well as risks. And an entrepreneur really has to be willing, but also have the capacity to manage employees in a productive way. And that's fundamental really to overcoming this hurdle, along with financial administrative systems that could support that kind of growth. The third step is securing a business site, and I call it a strategic business site, because while microenterprises often begin in a small, informal, sometimes precarious location, which it could be a street corner, it could be a sidewalk market, or even a borrowed room from their own residence or another family member's home, growth usually implies increasing space and even relocating to improve visibility, to improve security, and to build access to customers, increasing number of customers or new markets, which results in a more strategic, permanent, and a safe site. That's ultimately what they need. And so the step really requires a much larger investment than acquiring fixed assets. And so therefore it presents, to a certain degree, an even greater hurdle. And again, that's the key to this one is securing the capital needed to purchase and or build a strategic site. The fourth, which really was only surpassed by 15% of those I interviewed, was an expansion to additional sites. So moving beyond the initial strategic business site, then opening subsequent locations. And growing enterprises, they tend to often extend their physical presence to added locations, largely to create access to new customers. And it's a growth step that requires not only the capital, this is substantial capital to acquire the space and equip it, but also to increase management and administrative capacities so they can effectively oversee multi-site operations. And from the former slide where I showed some pictures of growth entrepreneurs, Laura and Miguel, who run the furniture workshop in the Dominican Republic, they spoke clearly. They had their sights set on buying a property in a commercial area of town where they felt they would be able to display their furniture and also reach new markets. And that was very important to them as a next step for growing their business. So each of these hurdles, they reveal where targeted products and services could potentially assist entrepreneurs in progressing in their development and advancing to a new stage of growth. And so, as we think of supporting entrepreneurs in their growth progression, in terms of financial services, tailoring a loan product, such as not just a fixed asset loan in some cases or a car loan, but especially in securing a site, what kind of a lending product, a modified like home improvement loan or housing microfinance product could be adapted also for a business site, or do they actually need some type of a mortgage backed loan to purchase an existing site or purchase property? That kind of thinking seems to be like a great opportunity for ways to support this kind of enterprise growth, as well as adding services that would assist entrepreneurs in improving their administration, specifically in the area of record keeping, financial record keeping and accounts, but other systems as well. And something I point to in the study is as enterprises grow and become more complex, it seems that a more tailored, custom-made service could be more beneficial to entrepreneurs reaching these higher levels of growth. So they may need something that's much more customized. So I'd like to move on to some of the other findings regarding women in emerging SMEs. As I mentioned earlier, women did not figure prominently among the growth entrepreneurs. Really, there was only one who appeared, and that's Esperanza in the picture there. I'll talk about her in a moment. However, women are involved as joint owners, and in over half of the cases, they occupy a very important support role, which is often as an administrator. They manage financial accounts, and many of them handle customer relations and sales as well. And these are roles that seem to allow them greater flexibility that adapt well to their family care responsibilities, such as raising young kids. Interestingly, in several cases, there were also sequences similar to what I explained about Magda and her business. How she began that small snack shop on the college campus, and then over time, when it moved to a strategic site, then her husband jumped in and helped her out. And this was a pattern that emerged in several cases where a woman, a female-owned enterprise, was then subsequently, you could say, handed off to a family member once it reached a certain point. And usually they stayed involved, but they were no longer, let's say, the visionary and the lead manager of that enterprise. And it seemed throughout the interviews that the primary reason that women were less involved in leadership of these high growth enterprises was for family care reasons. It seems that it was largely a decision that they had taken based on the context in which they were living, their family context, and the other priorities that they have in their life. So as we consider these findings, I just invite you to reflect on how they might shape our expectations of women-owned SMEs. Just leave that as a question for you. And finally, on this last slide, I wanted to talk just about one of the findings that was unexpected from my study. It was regarding investment practices of some of the entrepreneurs as they prepared for their older age and hopefully for a point where they could retire. Throughout the interviews, I was really taken with a repeated message that kept emerging of just feeling tired and exhausted. These entrepreneurs work so incredibly hard, the hours they put in, the difficulties they've had to overcome, and challenges. They've put their kids through school, they've built a home, they've done so many things to reach the point where they are at now. And there were just continued expressions of tiredness, fatigue, and really a longing, a desire to eventually be able to slow down and stop working. And at the same time, there's so few options for these entrepreneurs. They really don't have access to either private or public pension plans or funds. And most of them really view savings as a poor investment, so they are not saving significantly in financial institutions as a way of covering their future income needs. And yet, what surprised me was to find how prevalent it was that they were using rental properties as a means of providing future income stream so that they could one day really pull back from running their businesses. And in fact, several of them had used their loans. Over 10 of them had used their loans specifically to buy and build rental units, whether they were constructing above their existing home or buying new properties and developing those. But that seemed to be a common practice. And about what other options exist for low-income populations to finance retirement, what kinds of services could be developed as well. So those are some more questions that I feel merit further research. And that's a photo there of Hortensia. She and her husband are clients of Adopem. And they're both, in addition to being older and a bit tired, they have health issues, and really their aspiration, as they stated it, was to be able to retire on rentals, but they only had one small property. It just wasn't enough to cover their income needs at that time. So that's the presentation for now, and I would like to invite you, Sonia. Do you want to go ahead and begin taking some comments and questions?
Yeah, let's move to discussion. To kick off our discussion, I've actually already asked Georgina Vasquez to join us. We're going to unmute her here, but while we unmute her, let me tell you a little bit about her and why I've asked her to share a few remarks. She has over 20 years of experience in corporate finance with expertise in financial appraisals, analysis, and modeling. Prior to joining Omtrix, where she works in 2005, she provided independent financial consulting services to various organizations, including BN Fondos de Inversión, Banco Interfin, and the Emergency Liquidity Facility. She's currently an investment officer with Omtrix. She's responsible for coordinating the operations of the risk management facility and Calmedo. So you can see that Georgina Vasquez is approaching this topic from an investment perspective, but also with an eye to what financial institutions and credit markets are doing to help entrepreneurs grow. And so I'm going to turn it to Georgina to share a little bit about their research, which has just been released, and the reflections on Christy's research with their research in mind. Georgina, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you, Sonia. Well, I just like to commend Christy for a great investigation. It has given a lot of information that, to be honest, after we had conducted our own study, I think it's a lot of information that the MFIs currently don't manage, and it would be of great help for them. As you mentioned, Calmedo just released a study on basically what we try to focus is more on the side of the MFIs, those MFIs that are struggling, that are finding themselves in a more competitive markets, and they try to what we call cross the border, which means they try to serve larger MFI and microfinance institutions, microentrepreneurs, trying to serve the SMEs. And so what we tried to do is try to understand what was the experience they had, how did they prepare themselves, and overall, what was the result of such experience. And basically, we started the study last year. We also focused in Latin America. We thought it was a more representative market, as is a more mature market. And you see more MFIs trying to reach out to those SMEs, as it's becoming harder to attract new clients, to new microfinance clients. So we conducted the study in Latin America, trying to focus in 6 countries, which are Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Peru. We interviewed 25 MFIs. Some of them we interviewed in person, tried to assess more, try to understand a little bit better about their experience. And basically, what we were able to find out is that these MFIs and many who haven't crossed the border or are thinking about it see serving SMEs as like a natural step. That is something that is part of the process of maturing. And however, they don't prepare themselves properly. And I haven't seen in any of them managing information such as the one that Christy has developed. They do manage that kind of information, and they haven't defined a profile of their SME clients in order to better assess what kind of products their clients need or what kind of services they should provide or the way they should approach them. Basically, what we found is that while we interviewed them, all of them said that they had prepared themselves, that it was part of their strategy, and they had done their homework. By that, I mean that they said they defined what was their strategy. They tried to define that serving SME companies was part of their vision and mission, and they tried to figure out how to serve them. However, basically what we encountered while interviewing those institutions is that basically they really didn't prepare themselves. It's just much more of a reaction that these institutions had. And by saying that, we need also to understand what is their reality. We're facing institutions and markets where it's becoming really, really hard to attract new clients, and not also to attract new clients, to retain clients. Some of their clients started with small businesses, just like really like just where members participated or 1 or 2 members, but eventually they were started to grow and they demanded more funding. However, some of these companies or micro companies, as soon as they start growing up, they tend to leave the institutions. These MFIs have ceilings of funding, so they reach up to a point where you have to let them go. So one of the concerns of these institutions is that they just need to retain those clients because achieving new clients has become really hard. And we also have to remember that those institutions are maturing. Some of them have transformed from NGOs to regulated institutions, which involves a higher operating cost. They need to have like an audit department, risk department. They have to report to the regulator, and so on. And so they need to increase their income without affecting their cost structure. And serving SMEs, it turns out to be a good option. You have like bigger loans. You need less effort. You just, instead of having 100 loans of $1,000, you just have one loan of $100,000, and it's easier to monitor, to serve the client. So many institutions are leaning towards that direction. The problem is that when we were started talking and approaching, interviewing these institutions, is that normally they say that they prepare themselves, and what they do is just make a little twist to their methodology. It's the same experience that we saw many years ago when commercial banks thought that doing microfinance was the same thing. They were already doing consumer lending. So what's the difference between consumer lending and microfinance? They thought it was the same, and they really hurt themselves while doing that. But what we saw is that the same is happening with some of the microfinance institutions. They really don't prepare themselves. They don't really make an assessment of the market. They really don't understand the clients. And at times, you see that they're starting competing against commercial banks while they don't have structure nor experience. So basically, what we have found out is that they just make a little twist. They try to change a little bit their structures, their organizational structures. Normally, they choose their champions, their credit officer, their best credit officers, and then turn them into SME loan officers, which not always works for them. It's a total different animal, to say in a way. It's a total different situation just to assess a micro enterprise towards an SME. And at times it's very difficult for those credit officers, just what some of the MFIs call just to change the chip. You need to just to format the disk and try to think in a new way. And it doesn't happen all the time. Many of the institutions have use people with experience and have a structure and brought into institutions those people that already know how to serve SMEs, but that is like a minority. But the problem is that as they don't really make a real assessment of their current needs, they tend hurting themselves. What we also notice is that there's weaknesses in the design of the products that they serve. As Christy mentioned, as those businesses grow, they need a more customized service. They don't need the same service, and even the small details, as for instance, as they become larger businesses, they want to have like a treatment. They don't want to wait in line in branches, just waiting to cash a check or make a withdrawal of money. They just want a different service. They want someone to come to their businesses, have the special treatment that not always is given to those clients. And also, it's very important is that there are legal implications, because normally as the loans grow, at times they start taking guarantees over the loans, and at times they have trouble just figuring out the difference between the lender and the owner of the assets that's being given as a guarantee. So many of the institutions have been affected, and basically what we found out is that there's a great need in the market. However, those institutions are not serving it properly. We also included the case of one of the largest MFIs in Colombia, which is a bank, is converted into a bank, and they had to start it with a pilot project, and they started experiencing it with SMEs, and then they had to stop and just try to reduce themselves and rethink about their strategy. As of today, they are not currently serving this market, and the problem basically is because when these MFIs serve these businesses, they realize that the margins are lower, so they're taking more risk, they're granting bigger loans, but the margin is lower. Even if those contributes to absorb part of their operating cost, is much higher. And the problem is that at times they don't assess correctly the impact on their equity. While we were interviewing one of the MFIs in Peru, some of the the MFIs that participated in the survey but not in the interview really was struggling because they had granted a loan for almost $500,000 for one of their clients, and this client started having problems. And the thing is that it had another loan with a commercial bank. So the commercial bank was ahead of them. They had their legal department. They knew how to proceed, how to collect, to be the first one to be in place to collect the loans, and they were really having problems trying to recover even a portion of such loan. And you see that oftentimes with many of those institutions, they are just going blindfolded because that they can do things as usual, as they've been serving the micro entrepreneurs and not realizing the big differences that come with SMEs in institutions. We realize that there is a good opportunity for those institutions, but the market does need to make a better assessment of what is the market niche they're trying to jump into. So I think this study that Christy conducted will be of great value for most of these institutions that at this moment, most of them really don't have a clear sense of what is the market that they're currently serving.
Thank you for those comments, Georgina, directly from your research. It's great to hear about the perspective of the institutions, and especially some of the ways they're falling short, but also some of the things that they're doing that might be encouraging in terms of serving this market. I should mention to all of those who are listening that everything that Georgina is sharing is in a great report that Omtrix just launched that Georgina was the co-author on. And if you're interested in getting a link to that report or being connected directly with Georgina, feel free to let me know in the chat box. Why don't you type it into the chat? Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. I can type it into the chat box for all of you, and I'm also happy to directly connect you with Georgina over email after the webinar is over, if that's something you would be interested in. So I'm going to open it up to some of the other questions that we've been receiving. We're going to unmute Rodolfo Quiros in just a second, but Rodolfo's question is one that we heard from somebody else, so I'm going to read that other question. They're both along the same lines. The first question we received was from Larry Reed. A few years ago, he asked somebody from CARD why they had started an SME bank. And the person he was talking with said that their research showed that the communities that had done the best at lifting people out of poverty were those who had SME businesses. And they found that many of these businesses had started as CARD clients. So when they surveyed their client base, they found that only 5% of their clients had grown from micro to small size. So by creating an SME bank along with adding non-financial services, they hoped to raise that percentage to 10% or more. Now that's pretty modest still, moving from 5% to 10%. And as we just heard from Georgina, it seems like even that move from 5% to 10% could be a very big challenge for an institution. Rodolfo has had a question along the same line, so we're unmuting you, Rodolfo. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Great, go ahead.
I was just highlighting the fact that the samples that Christy was telling us about were quite small, and within those samples, she mentioned that there were even a lower number of firms that qualified with that criteria. This is in line with results and comments that, for example, Dale Adams had made years ago. So I was just wondering if there were some conclusions regarding this initial result, or if there was some interaction with the MFIs about those numbers.
Christy, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Thanks, Rodolfo. Um, it's not a happy message. I don't think anyone received that message with joy. But at the same time, having this clear snapshot of what's the current reality in terms of number of clients that are actually making that transition, and then a clear description of what they look like, what again, these growth hurdles. It seems to be it's an equipping type of process that hopefully will allow them to better target and serve not only that segment that is having a development impact in those communities, but also raise up others that could have that potential. And I think that's really the intention, is to increase the numbers without expecting that will necessarily lead to a huge increase. But even doubling, as in the case of card, I mean, that would be significant to be able to bring in more potential enterprises and entrepreneurs up through that development process. So what the institutions that I worked with are going to do with this, I haven't followed up specifically in terms of what their plans are, but they were definitely grateful for this. And the whole reason that they wanted to participate in this study was specifically along the lines of what Georgina said. They have kind of organically or naturally begun serving or continued serving their existing clients as they've moved up in their borrowing needs, and so they want to be more aware of who they are and how they can serve them.
Rodolfo, are you still with us? Oh, sorry, we have to unmute you again. Rodolfo?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, did you want to respond to that at all? I mean, obviously, is this something that you have resonated with and that you've seen in your work, that this group of growing entrepreneurs that are moving from micro to small size are a very, very small percentage of microfinance portfolios?
Exactly, and it is precisely that fact that you just mentioned what bothers everyone, as Christy was saying. The fact that what is the value added of all the microfinance movement, and why, and it is perhaps not only a function of the financial institutions, but many other activities or the environment in which these micro-entrepreneurs operate. But it is a big concern, the fact that such a small number of micro-entrepreneurs are able to grow and to become a stable small firm. There's also supply issues, as Georgina was mentioning, but more than looking at the problem from a supply side perspective, it is perhaps a problem that should be raised and analyzed from a demand and institutional environment or environment in general perspectives. So yes, I share the concern with Christy that the figures are sad. It is quite a concern, and it is not only an issue regarding how they are served by financial institutions.
And this is something that Beth Ryan talked a little bit about, the importance of when she shared about why this question was chosen as a research topic. Beth, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, yeah, thanks, Sonia. I just wanted to say that I think that the emphasis in Christy's work on identifying the hurdles is kind of the key here, and maybe the expectations about what percentage of clients has the potential or the interest in making the transition from micro to small, is maybe that number is not ever going to be as big as we would like. But I think that what Christy's work does is help us to focus on understanding what gets in the way for those people who are trying, and then that would help in terms of having interventions that work. I mean, I think one of the key things there is support people who are trying to grow, and that is not everybody, and don't try to make everybody grow, because that's not the purpose of the businesses. I guess one other thing I would have to say just on the value of the services that are being provided by microfinance is that if the goal of a business is essentially family maintenance, that's an important goal, and microfinance's ability to support that and support modest growth that doesn't transform into small is still a very valuable service.
Beth, if I can just add to that too, in the report, I talk a little bit more about that 75% low growth, and it's not, kind of as you're saying, it's not to suggest a diminished value. The focus of the study was on enterprise growth and reaching SME levels, but these are all successful entrepreneurs. All 100% that I visited, they had growing enterprises, and many had diversified. Many were slowing down because of their age, but they had invested heavily in family equity building and in building businesses, as I mentioned, of other family members, and homes, and providing, future rental income. So these are highly successful people who have provided incredible, not just financial, but social resources to their families and communities, but they simply were not running high growth enterprises. And these are some of the tangible benefits of microfinance, but may not lead to a high growth business.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Christy, that people's goals are different, and for a microfinance institution to be able to offer the tools that people need to reach their goals, whatever they are, I think is really critical. I'd love to turn our discussion now to the topic of formalization. Christy, this is something you talked a lot about in the paper that we didn't spend a whole lot of time on this morning, but I'd like to dedicate a little bit of time to it because we've gotten a question on it. I'm going to read the question because it comes from Virginia Soto, and she does not have a microphone right now, but she's based in Venezuela, and she says that the studies that she's done in Venezuela have noted that successful businesses, successful in terms of their growth, are not always formalized from a legal point of view, but they're organized. They have systematic ways of dealing with things. They have policies and procedures that they rely on, and this makes her think that it's the formalization that occurs from common sense of people that has nothing to do with regulatory frameworks. And she's wondering about the whether that was something you observed, number one, Christy, and then my follow-up question is whether that is legitimate in terms of people, having processes and procedures in place, but maybe not being formalized from a legal perspective. Christy, can you comment on that?
Yes, entirely in agreement with you, Virginia. It seemed that the whole formalization issue was dealt with very practically by the entrepreneurs. There were three kind of main factors that were defining their level of formalization, and one is very contextually specific. What kind of regulation exists? Is it a hindrance? Is it easy for them to be formalized? Are there different? What's the level of for example, Ecuador was a context where there was a very high level enforcement, so we saw much more formalization among businesses compared to Peru or the Dominican Republic. Another factor, in addition to context, tended to be who were the clients or the customers, and who were the suppliers? Who were they purchasing from, and who were they selling to? And did that dictate whether they needed a certain level of formalization? For example, if they need to turn in receipts, then they would get whatever level of formalization they needed to turn in receipts. And if they really needed to buy from informal suppliers because that would keep them more competitive, then they wouldn't pursue formalization in that area. So it was kind of a spectrum, and I also found that they would move kind of back and forth depending on what was their best situation at any given moment. The third factor was visibility or location. So if they were selling in a market that was run by the municipality, they had to be legally registered and pay some kind of a fee or tax, you could say. But those who sold on on an informal market on a street corner didn't have to deal with those kinds of restrictions or obligations. And likewise, a restaurant that's highly visible on a street corner, something that is very clearly visible and accessible and can be spotted by tax authorities, tended to be more formalized than a very large workshop that I found, but hidden in someone's garage that was not all that evident or apparent. So it really was a practical consideration in the end, and entrepreneurs, they tended to just manage that to their benefit. I'm not sure I answered both the questions.
This is Beth. Can I ask a question, or of anybody? I understand there's a big process going on within a few Latin American countries of requiring e-invoices, and it's a way of capturing more of the economic activities so that it can be taxed more easily. But I just wonder if you ran into that at all, and if anybody else who's in the audience knows anything about that they would like to comment on.
Yeah, if you know something about that, feel free to raise your hand. There's a little hand icon, and if you click that, it'll raise your hand, and we'll know to call on you. Christy, do you have any comments on that?
No, I didn't encounter that at all.
Yeah, that's a really interesting trend to watch. Well, if there's anybody who has any comments on that based on where you're based or where your work is, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. In the meantime, I'm going to turn to Susie Cheston. Susie worked in El Salvador during the Civil War there, which is really interesting. And Susie, I'll let you share your question, but I think your question is very appropriate given Christy's finding that growth entrepreneurs are ones that have focus and have a single business. And in places where there's a lot of insecurity, Susie's wondering whether having one business and a strong focus is really the smartest option. Susie, can you hear us?
Yes, Sonia, thanks. I think you expressed the question very well. And certainly Christy is familiar with those kinds of issues of external circumstances that may have a number of difficulties because of political violence or other kinds of obstacles. And so the question is really, I was very struck by the point that she made that people who invested in just one business were the ones who seem to have made them grow. And I'm wondering if, how she might reflect on that in a variety of contexts where they might not have that luxury or might not perceive themselves as having that luxury.
Yeah, it was a defining characteristic. I'm not sure, was it a cause or effect? In some ways, I feel like their business required that level of dedication of them because of the amount of growth they were pursuing. So it didn't leave them any time really to invest in other endeavors. And I just assume it's part of that whole risk-return profile that a business owner has to consider in engaging in business. They're going for high returns, but they're also undertaking much larger risks in many ways by dedicating themselves only to one business and really moving forward with considerable effort and investment in that business. And so I sense, that it was necessary for them for that high growth business, but I definitely wouldn't recommend that necessarily in a certain case. It would depend on the individual and their profile.
Susie, any comments on that?
Well, I really appreciate Christy's work. I think she did a really terrific job of identifying a variety of aspects of this. And I think uh, in light of those four characteristics she found, I think those are really important to look at, but also recognize that they may not be possible in different circumstances. As I said, she knows that just as well as I do, if not more. So, but I really appreciate this research and the contribution that she's made.
Thanks, Christy.
Yeah, good point.
And yeah, that's something that we have found in some of the work that we've been doing here at CFI on financial health. We've been interviewing people all over the developing world just to ask what their definition of financial health is. And I'll share one story of this guy who was a real entrepreneur. Like he just could only think of business opportunities, and he had something like 8 businesses, and the small barbershop paid for the pool hall, paid for the other thing, and he just had all of these businesses, but his goal was to narrow them down to one so he could really focus, because he felt like he was spread very thin. But for him, it was his strategy of success as an entrepreneur to figure out which one was going to succeed. And when one of them was in trouble, he had the others to fall back on. And so I wonder if there's in some sense, even beyond the question of instability in a particular market context, if there's a chicken and the egg issue here. He really wanted to narrow his businesses down to one, but that was extremely difficult when he couldn't focus on any one of them. And so yeah, it seems like it's a difficult thing to figure out whether to narrow down first and really put all of your effort towards one business, or to focus on all of them and see which one succeeds and then to narrow down. So yeah, I think, Susie, your point is really interesting, that we see different models of success, even though those who we look back and say, oh, they've grown a lot, are, yeah.
Can I just add to what Susie said? We intentionally left out El Salvador because of the instability there with the continued gang violence and such. And so in many ways, our study really did focus on probably more stable and common, similar contexts, Susie. So your point is well taken. This might look quite different in a setting that has instability, violence, war, or other situations going on.
Thanks for that exchange. I appreciate it. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Christy, I was wondering, could you share one thing you want to be sure that we take away from this conversation today? Christy, are you with us still?
I am. I'm thinking. One thing to take away. I just personally, I just so valued these entrepreneurs, and so I guess I want everyone to take away the sense that all of these clients are to be valued, both the growth entrepreneurs and all of these that are being classified as lower growth groups. We have an incredible amount of impact and success in that pool, and so that is all to be celebrated, not just the less than 2% that reach SME level. I guess that's the thing. I came away highly encouraged from this research in what I saw happening, and I feel like there's just a lot more work to be done, not just in helping enterprises to grow, but also this whole issue of how do we help them better prepare for their retirement, their well-earned retirement.
Thanks, Christy. Well, we have just a couple minutes, and I wanted to mention that we'd love to stay in touch with you. Feel free to visit our website, where you can download the paper, read a short summary or share the research, we've put the link up on the screen here, and we'll also be sharing it in the chat box so that you have it there as well. I also mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that our next webinar will be in mid-December, where we'll be announcing the next cohort of CFI fellows. We have 5 excellent fellows that we're moving forward with this year that we're really excited about, and especially excited about sharing with you the different research questions and the way that we're approaching them this year, because we'd love for you to be a part of the research process. Don't close your webinar software just yet. We're gonna put up a brief survey to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on how to facilitate growth among entrepreneurs, and we'll be using that as we move forward as a lens for analyzing how effective this research was, and what you can do with it. So we'd love to stay in touch on that front. So while you're filling that out, I'll just say thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to our next conversation, and are very encouraged by the discussions that we've heard, and especially from those of you who are engaging with entrepreneurs who want to grow their businesses from micro to small size. Thanks so much.